Hi, folks. So this is Jason in Ghana, Accra, president of Bible College Theological Seminary, dealing with Muslim apologist um, Ijaz Ahmed and concerning the crucifixion. Now we looked at the issue of the Quran and the what is the textual veracity, what is the textual basis for the verse that are quoted that they use to do the textual criticism of the Bible. So we looked at Surah 4157, and here is the book by Daniel Allen Brubaker, 72. Uh, the Surah 42:21. There are manuscripts there that have issues concerning the text. There is Surah 30, verse 9. The St. Peter number 30 folio manuscript has issues. Surah 691, 697 has issues, and that's in the M42474 folio at the Museum of Islamic Art, etc. And you can go into this in more detail, but when Muhammad Hijab starts saying, "Oh, there are textual variants in the New Testament, we can't trust it as historical information," which is nonsense because he's not using a historical method. He's just coming up with his own ideas. Um, when you start to apply that to this key verse, well, what's the textual history of this verse? Can you give me the manuscripts that that your translation of the Quran is used, and has it verified it? And there's never been a textual edition of the Quran done. That's the Cambridge Companion of the Quran has said that. So you can't get better scholarship than that. So basically, they're basing the main argument about Jesus didn't die on this verse. Now, there's no specifics in this verse. There's no eyewitness material from this verse. It's 600 years after Jesus from this verse. So, uh, what evidence is there to trust this? And Ijaz will say, well, that's a bad argument, Jason, because your New Testament, we don't get manuscripts till the third, fourth century mentioning the crucifixion, fourth century, Sinaiticus Vaticanus. Well, the thing about that is that nobody disagrees that the New Testament, unless you're extreme skeptic, nobody would say that the New Testament wasn't written either before the first century or coming into a little bit of the early second century. But most scholars would agree that the New Testament was written in the first century. Um, so this hyper skepticism from Ijaz is just incredible. He wouldn't use the same skepticism to his own to his own Quran. The other thing about this issue is when you look at Homer's Iliad, it was written 800 BC. Earliest copies 400 BC. That's 400 years after. We have 643 copies of that. Tacitus, we have uh, his books 100 AD written, earliest copy 1100. We have 20 copies, and yet historians will say we have much of Tacitus, much of Homer, yet we have New Testament date written 50 to 100. We have 144, 114 fragments, 200 books, 250 most of the New Testament, and 325 complete New Testament. Within 50 years, the fragments. Within 100 years, 200 books. 150 years, 250 most of the New Testament. Complete 325, 225 years. So when you're doing history and historical criticism of text, the New Testament an amazing book to say that we can trust its historical reliability. If historians can develop history from Tacitus and Homer from such scanty uh, remains, how much more with the New Testament. So his skepticism is incredibly hyper skepticism, and he doesn't use it to his own Quran at all. The next thing I'd like to discuss is the historical issues with the Quran. The issue of Mecca. Dr. Rafat Amari has noted that early historians, um, he's noted many historians. He says, in our study, we now come to the 2nd century BC. Without a doubt, the most important geographer and historian of the time was Agatharchis of Alexandria, who wrote between 145 132 BC. He was born at the Greek city of Sindus, and he was believed to be a major figure in compiling Egypt's political history in the 2nd century. And he just notes that there's so many historians that traveled Arabia in the first, like, 2nd century BC, even 4th century BC, right up to 1st century AD, and they find little evidence um, for the Mecca for Mecca, which is a major story that Abraham went to Mecca. Mecca is a kind of it comes later. It doesn't. We can't find any information like back in the time of Abraham about Mecca. So even if we push it back to, say, 3 or 400 BC, which there's no evidence of Mecca then, even if we pushed it there, it still doesn't give evidence. It still shows that when they say Abraham went to Mecca, and this is the foundation of Islam, that it came from Abraham in Mecca with the carved stone. If there's no evidence of that, the whole of Islam collapses, and the Quran and the Hadiths are just not historically reliable. So I would read studies by classical writers show that Mecca could not have been built before 4th century AD. Dr. Rafat Amari. So, in other words, the Quran and the Hadiths are not historically reliable. The whole foundation of Islam is a total lie. This idea that that Muhammad traveled on a horse to the temple. There was no temple there. It was destroyed in 70 AD. Again, the lack of historical reliability of the Quran. And yet they want to, Ijaz wants to attack the Bible. Ijaz wants to say there's no evidence for the crucifixion. When you look at the multiple attestation, when you look at Josephus, Tacitus, enemies acknowledging that Christ had died in the time of Jesus, multiple attestation shows that Christ was crucified. He says that Tacitus and Josephus, we have manuscripts 10th century. Again, hyperskepticism. No historian takes that kind of skepticism. It is true what he's saying, but we have a number of copies of Tacitus. We have a number of copies of Josephus, and these copies, when we look at history and we collaborate them with other historians, we find that there's evidence and truth that these are the authors, and that that they are correct in what they're saying about history. Not 100%, but they're generally correct. And so it's hyper skepticism, and people like Dominic Crossan, who's a skeptic, and Bart Ehrman is a skeptic, all agree that Christ, Ludemann, who's an atheist, Ludwig Ludemann, I think it is, an atheist, all agree that Christ was crucified because they accept it on basic historical multiple attestation, enemy attestation. So, and then the other thing as well is this Quranic verse in Surah 4 is influenced by Gnostic teaching. So, for example, we read in the Coptic Apocalypse of Peter, I saw him, Jesus seemingly being seized by him, and I said, what do I see, O Lord? That it is you yourself they take, that you are grasping of me, or is this one? And if you read it, it's very similar to the Quran. Then you read the second treatise of Great Seth. I visited a bodily dwelling. I cast out the one who was in previously, and I went in. The whole multitude of the archons was disturbed, and all the physical matter of the archons, along with the powers born. But I am from above the heavens. I did not refuse them. On the one hand, I became the Christ. And these Gnostic Nag Hammadi, documents. They don't like matter. Matter is evil, and there is a spirit. So this Gnostic theology is within these texts, and as you read them, as you read these Gnostic texts, they deny Christ as crucified. I'm just trying to find the main one. Against Heresies by Irenaeus quotes Basilides, who's a Gnostic. He did not himself suffer death, but Simon, certain man of Cyrene, being compelled, bore the cross in his stead, so that this later being transfigured by him, that he might be thought to be Jesus, was crucified through ignorance and error, while Jesus himself received the form of Simon, and standing by laughed at them. So that's Irenaeus quoting a Gnostic writer and their beliefs. But if you read the Nag Hammadi Gospels and writings, you know, it's obvious that the Quran has got its ideas from there, because they deny, generally, most of them, if not all of them, they deny the crucifixion of Christ. And they have weird ideas about matter being evil. So Muhammad, or someone who edited the Quran, had an issue with the cross, got their ideas from the Gnostics concerning the crucifixion. When you look at the early coins, the first early coins in the first 40 or 50 years of Islam after Muhammad, the coins have the cross on, but round about 691, the cross goes, and so it must have been round about there that this verse was put in. And but we can't find that out because they don't do textual criticism of the Quran. Yeah, so obviously they've got it from the Gnostics. It's a political issue. The Byzantines had the cross on their coins. The Muslims used the Byzantine coins, and then they decided that they didn't want to use the Byzantine coins. They got rid of the cross, and this verse in Surah 4 is to back their political system. So there's a political issue in that verse. There's also textual issues in that verse. There's also theological issues in that Quranic verse of Surah 4. And the issue is, it mentions the Messiah. Where did that come from? That was borrowed from the Bible. So you're not only borrowing Gnostic sources, you're borrowing biblical sources, and then you're trying to mix it up and change it. So these are just some of the issues: the lack of historical reliability of the Quran, the issue of the Gnostic influence, the issue of hyperskepticism about the text. I could go on and on and on, but that'll do for now. Actual evidence, more historical evidence. So Josephus and Tacitus is good evidence that Christ died on a cross. To deny that is just super hyperskepticism. Not even Bart Ehrman or Dominic Crossan, who were world authorities on that topic, would agree with him, and they don't agree with me as an evangelical. So that'll do for now. I hope that's been a blessing. God bless you.